I'm presenting work that is a project that Georgina Rojas-García at CIESAS, the Institute for Higher Research and Education in Anthropology of Mexico. She and I are the co-PIs, and Alonso Perez is a very capable research assistant who helped sort of co-author this work. And yeah, we're calling this Inside the Black Box because we're looking at intra-organizational dynamics within street vendor organizations. And yeah, well, so we're overstating the case somewhat, but we're talking about 5 blind spots. Of course, there are other people who, like us, are investigating these blind spots, but we're arguing that most research on organizational efficacy emphasizes external factors rather than internal ones. So power resource theory, political process theory, we're looking inside these street vendor organizations. Once you look inside organizations, a lot of research on participation ends up looking at individual factors. What makes individuals participate in a union or in a social movement? We're looking at organizational factors. And I don't think this is a surprise to the audience at this conference. Research on worker organizations still primarily is focusing on trade unions, but like others, we're focusing on informal worker organizations in this research. Once you get to research on informal worker organizations, it tends to be single country cases. We're doing a cross-national comparison. And then finally, a lot of this research on worker organizations and social movement organizations tends to look at success outcomes. Are these organizations making a difference? Which is an important question, and we'll have something to say about that as well. But rather than seeing the nature of leadership and the kinds of benefits and opportunities that organizations offer as independent variables driving success, we're actually looking at what drives variation in these factors, leadership development and services. So we're actually trying to explain these differences in kind of the internal structure of the organizations. We're looking at street vendor organizations. We're doing a nested comparison of Mexico and the United States. So within each country, we're looking at 2 cities. In the United States, it's New York and Los Angeles. In Mexico, it's Mexico City and Oaxaca. Just to point out, 3 very large cities. Oaxaca is smaller, and in a bit, I'll say why we went to Oaxaca. But one important reason is that Oaxaca state is the most indigenous state within Mexico, and the city itself is 44% indigenous. So it's a rather different vendor population than you have in Mexico City. And just again, comparing New York and Los Angeles, just the 2 organizations, each one has one major organization. The New York organization, they literally hold meetings in 7 languages. I attended, a leadership training which they're translating into 7 languages. So you think this is hard. And whereas in Los Angeles, it's basically the vendors are coming from Mexico and Central America, so Spanish is sufficient. So again, we're looking at inter-organizational factors. I do want to emphasize this is very early preliminary findings, and really we're at an exploratory stage, so a lot of this is going to be descriptive. The last slide, we've sort of attempted to get a little more analytical, but we haven't gotten that far. So starting with some similarities between the 4 cities. And the first point is that really the main issue in all 4 of these cities is, can street vendors actually vend in public space? They're constantly fighting for that right. Now, once you sort of peel off that layer of the onion, there's variation in exactly what the regulatory regimes are in the 4 cities. So you've got less permissive and more permissive regimes. And you've also got situations where there's a legal framework for vending. I, I wrote vending illegal as the other option. It's not that it's illegal, it's that there's no legal structure that says you can vend under these circumstances. It's simply not written into law, which makes it highly contested. So just to quickly say something about each of the four cities, in New York, street vending has been legal for well over a century, but there's a cap on the number of permits for street vendors so that only a small fraction of existing vendors are actually permitted, which, you know, obviously leads to issues of enforcement. In Los Angeles, the legalization is quite recent. We're talking about 2018. Basically, vendors are still adjusting, and the regime is still being sort of reconfigured to make it more possible to navigate. So they're having a hard time getting the permits. And written into the law is a provision that sort of compelling public interest can allow cities to declare certain areas off limits for vendors. So that's become a major sort of boundary of struggle. Turning to Mexico, well, there's in Oaxaca, we're calling this less permissive. There's no law at all specifying rights. However, the city government has given permits to some organizations, and the state government, so Mexico, like the United States, has a federalist system. The state government has basically extended forbearance to other organizations that have had a particular sort of problems. For example, killings of leaders that have led them to the state to say, okay, well, we're going to, you know, give you some space because of that. In Mexico City, there isn't a legal framework yet, but there's what they call lineamientos, principles for legislation were issued in 2019, and there's promises of more. But in all four of these cities, there's sort of this continuing threat of enforcement. A second similarity is that in all four cases, these organizations have been able to advance their rights. This is not accidental because we sampled on success. We wanted to sample large, successful street vendor organizations because that allows us to then sort of look at the various processes involved. And I said that I would say why it was we went to Oaxaca. Well, we started with Mexico City, which you kind of have to in Mexico. We then sort of went down through the urban hierarchy, Monterrey, Guadalajara, León, Guanajuato, and kept on finding cities where basically the street vendor organizations had largely collapsed due to the kind of repression that I was talking about in the previous slide. So Oaxaca was sort of the next place that we could find where there actually was large, effective street vendor organizations. And although our main focus is internal, we're willing to talk about power resource theory. And when you look at sort of why are they succeeding, in the US cases, it's really about societal or symbolic power. And interestingly, the most recent advances in both of the United States cases arose from crises. So in 2020, during the pandemic, street vendors suddenly lost their income in New York. They had no source of government support because they were not anybody's employee. In most cases, they were off the books. And so there was a struggle that both won a right to pandemic benefits for them and other informal workers like domestic workers, and also expanded the number of permits by 4,000. Now, unfortunately, 4,000 still means that only about a quarter of the vendors are legal, but that was still a significant step forward. In Los Angeles, the crisis was the election of Trump. Most of the street vendors are undocumented, and essentially the California state legislature, some of the Latino representatives said, Trump is deporting undocumented people, especially if they get involved with the criminal justice system. If we are criminalizing street vending, all these people are going to get deported. And essentially, in California politics, that was a powerful argument that led the legislature to create a legal framework for street vending. In Mexico City, it's primarily associational power. It's the formation of sort of a powerful coalition that was able to bargain with a populist government. And as I said before, the principles were adopted in 2019. A new governor has just taken office and basically made a set of promises to these organizations about further institutionalization. In Oaxaca, it's a little more Wild West. It's really a question of either allow us to stay or we will block the center of the city, block traffic in the center of the city. So I'm calling that structural power, although it's not your usual form of structural power. But there are also important differences between the cities. So in terms of organizational ecosystems, we're sort of grouping these into fragmented and unified. And the two US cases are relatively unified. You've basically got one large organization in each of these cities, in New York and Los Angeles. The difference is that in Los Angeles, what you've got is what's called the Los Angeles Street Vendor Campaign, which is a coalition of organizations, one of which is doing the actual organizing of street vendors, the Community Power Collective. The others are the ones that provide services, and they've been working, advocating for legalization, and now sort of working with the street vendors in this newly legalized regime. We're calling Mexico City semi-fragmented. There's a lot of organizations, but there's also, as I mentioned before, a new and dominant coalition called the Mega Bloque of 4 federations of street vendors that has essentially, after attempts by the Mexico City government to fragment the organizations, they've reconsolidated. There was a major push to fragment them in 2007, but they've bounced back to some extent. But each federation is, or each organization is basically providing its own services to members. In Oaxaca, very fragmented, a small organization, some just with, a couple of dozen members. In terms of the services provided, the most basic service for all these organizations is basically assuring members a place to sell, which may mean you have to intervene with the government. It may also mean that you sort of prevent organized crime from extorting vendors to be able to sell in different areas. So that's basic. Most of them are providing some kind of technical or legal business services. This is much more extensive in the United States. Although in Mexico City, there is a Supreme Court case that's been brought by the organizations, although that's partly through the intervention of WIGO, the International Women in Informal Employment Globalizing and Organizing. The Mexican organizations do provide sort of, if you will, constituent services. 2 minutes, okay. Well, moving right along. And then the last column, we're talking about leadership development itself is a form of service. And it's particularly expansive in the Los Angeles case and actually in the Mexico City case, where you have this quote, the Mega Bloque is a school for leaders. It's more limited in the other two. Leadership selection and development. The dedazo in Mexico is traditionally how the next president is picked. The president basically with their dedo, with their finger, picks the next person. So in the Mexican organizations, it's the leadership succession tends to be by appointment in that sense, or inheritance. Sons inheriting from fathers. Oaxaca, because so many of the male leaders have been assassinated, the wives have inherited. And you've got different extensive member leadership development. It's by far the thickest in Los Angeles. So we're arguing that there are 3 different models here, and this is as analytical as we get. A muscle-intensive model, which is really mainly emphasizing defending the right to sell. Why are these Mexican organizations using the muscle model? Well, they don't have, there's no philanthropic ecosystem that can give them the support to actually have a staff that could provide a broader set of services, but they do have these sources of muscle that I mentioned before. The kind of leadership development process of Dedaso, or family inheritance, is essentially saying leadership, selecting the next leadership is based on trust built with the existing leadership. So it's very much, I trust my son, or I trust this deputy who can take over from me. A second model, which we're calling service intensive, is really the New York model. So very strong on business assistance, legal assistance, technical assistance, supported by a strong philanthropic ecosystem, so they have a very large staff. At the same time, not as strong on leadership development because members have come to expect services, the organization has become oriented to providing services, and members are frustrated since there's been no advances since 2020, so essentially providing services is a way to deal with that frustration. Third case, or third category, which we're calling the leadership development intensive, is Los Angeles, where a very strong participatory leadership development process that actually builds a huge amount of conviviality. So attending leadership trainings for the Community Power Collective, it's fun. I mean, this is, you can understand why these members are showing up time and again, because it's these wonderful participatory, very, very communal activities. So again, supported by philanthropy, but with a disposition towards building participation that's also underpinned by the kind of ongoing progress that means you can basically have 45 leaders coming to, training after training because they're excited about what's being accomplished. Okay, I'm only 10 seconds late, I think, so thanks.